Hello, and welcome to Nap to History, a quiet space where we slow down and let the past unfold, one soft story at a time. Tonight, we'll gently explore a complex and deeply human chapter from World War II, examining the unexpected connections that formed between American soldiers and German women during and after the conflict. This isn't a story about memorizing battle dates or troop movements, but rather about understanding the very human emotions, circumstances, and relationships that emerged from one of history's darkest periods. Whether you're lying down for the night or just taking a moment to breathe, I'm really glad you're here. If you find comfort in calm, thoughtful history, feel free to subscribe. There's always another peaceful chapter waiting. Before we begin this journey back in time, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and share if you enjoy calm historical storytelling like this. Let's take a moment to set the stage. World War II lasted from 1939 to 1945. Reshaping the global landscape in ways that still echo today. For American soldiers, the war meant leaving behind familiar shores, crossing vast oceans, and finding themselves in foreign lands where everything from the language to the customs seemed alien. When the fighting finally ended in May 1945, millions of young American men found themselves not returning home immediately, but stationed as occupying forces in a defeated Germany. The Germany they encountered was a nation in ruins, both physically and spiritually. Cities lay in rubble, families were torn apart, and an entire population grappled with the aftermath of a devastating conflict. It was in this unlikely setting that some of the most unexpected and profound human connections would form between former enemies who, in peacetime, discovered they shared more similarities than differences. The story begins in the spring of 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into German territory. 22-year-old Private James Morrison from a small farming town in Iowa found himself part of the Third Army advancing through Bavaria. Like most of his fellow soldiers, James had spent years viewing Germans as the enemy, faceless figures in uniform who represented everything America was fighting against. But as his unit moved through the countryside, establishing temporary headquarters in requisitioned houses and buildings, James began to encounter German civilians for the first time. The first German woman James spoke to was not a romantic encounter, but a practical necessity. His unit had been assigned to a partially damaged house on the outskirts of Nuremberg, and the elderly landlady, Frau Weber, spoke a few words of English. She was perhaps 60 years old, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and tired eyes that had seen too much. When James approached her to arrange for basic supplies, he expected hostility or fear. Instead, he found a woman who, despite everything, treated him with cautious courtesy. "Mein Sohn," she said quietly, pointing to a photograph on the mantelpiece. "My son. He was in Russia. He did not come home." Her English was halting but clear enough. James looked at the photograph of a young man in German uniform, probably not much older than himself, and felt something shift inside him. This wasn't propaganda or military strategy. This was a mother grieving for her lost child, no different from the mothers back home in Iowa who had lost their sons to this same terrible war. As the weeks passed and the occupation took on a more permanent character, interactions between American soldiers and German civilians became more frequent and complex. The military had strict non-fraternization policies in place, forbidding American personnel from forming personal relationships with German citizens. These rules, however, proved difficult to enforce in practice, as soldiers found themselves working alongside German civilians in reconstruction efforts, sharing common spaces, and gradually discovering their shared humanity. Sergeant Robert Chen, a 24-year-old medic from San Francisco, encountered this complexity firsthand when he was assigned to help establish a medical clinic in a small Bavarian town. The clinic needed to serve both American personnel and German civilians, which meant working closely with local healthcare workers who had survived the war. Among them was Maria Hoffman, a 26-year-old nurse whose husband had been killed on the Eastern Front 2 years earlier. Maria spoke excellent English, having studied it in university before the war. She was efficient, knowledgeable, and dedicated to her work, often staying late to ensure that patients received proper care regardless of their nationality. Robert found himself impressed not just by her professional competence, but by her quiet dignity in the face of tremendous personal loss. Unlike the propaganda images that had portrayed German women as either fanatical supporters of the Nazi regime or victims in need of rescue, Maria was simply a capable professional doing her job under difficult circumstances. Their first real conversation happened during a particularly long night when they were treating casualties from a truck accident that had involved both American soldiers and German workers. As they worked side by side, Robert found himself asking about her background, her training, her thoughts on the work they were doing. Maria answered thoughtfully, without the guarded responses he had expected. She spoke of her hope that the clinic could become a symbol of healing not just for physical wounds, but for the broader injuries that war had inflicted on their community. "I studied English because I wanted to travel," Maria told him during a brief break, as they shared coffee that tasted more like chicory than anything resembling the real thing. "I thought perhaps I would go to America or England, see the places I had only read about in books." She paused, looking out the window at the rubble-strewn street. "Now America has come to me, though not in the way I imagined." Robert found himself thinking about that conversation long after his shift ended. Here was a woman who, despite everything she had experienced, still maintained hope and curiosity about the world beyond her immediate circumstances. She challenged his preconceptions about what German citizens thought and felt, revealing a complexity that military briefings had never conveyed. The attraction that developed between American soldiers and German women during this period was not simply a matter of wartime loneliness or conquest, though those factors certainly played a role. Instead, it emerged from a more fundamental human need for connection and understanding in the aftermath of tremendous trauma. Both American soldiers and German civilians found themselves in unfamiliar territory, literally and emotionally, seeking stability and meaning in a world that had been turned upside down. For many American soldiers, the Germany they discovered bore little resemblance to the enemy they had been trained to fight. Instead of the militaristic, goose-stepping caricatures of wartime propaganda, they found ordinary people struggling to rebuild their lives from the ashes of defeat. German women, in particular, often impressed American soldiers with their resilience, intelligence, and dignity in the face of hardship. Lieutenant William Patterson, a 23-year-old from Boston who had studied German literature in college before the war, found himself assigned to work with local officials in organizing the distribution of humanitarian supplies. This work brought him into regular contact with Ingrid Müller, a 30-year-old former teacher who had lost her position when the Nazi government restricted women's employment opportunities. Ingrid now worked with various relief organizations, helping to coordinate aid for displaced persons and war orphans. William's academic knowledge of German culture had been overlaid with years of wartime propaganda, creating a mental image of German society that proved to be wildly inaccurate when confronted with reality. Ingrid was well-educated, articulate, and possessed a deep knowledge of literature and philosophy that rivaled his own university training. More importantly, she demonstrated a moral courage that challenged everything he thought he knew about German complicity in Nazi atrocities. "You must understand," Ingrid explained during one of their working sessions, as they reviewed lists of children who needed to be relocated to functioning schools. Not everyone who remained in Germany supported what happened. Some of us tried to resist in small ways, to maintain our humanity even when the world seemed to have gone mad. She spoke quietly, but with an intensity that suggested these were thoughts she had carried for years without being able to express them safely. William found himself drawn not just to Ingrid's intelligence and competence, but to her willingness to grapple with difficult moral questions about complicity, resistance, and responsibility. These were conversations he couldn't have with his fellow soldiers, who were understandably focused on completing their service and returning home. With Ingrid, he could explore the complex ethical landscape of the war and its aftermath, examining questions that had no easy answers. The development of romantic relationships between American soldiers and German women was complicated by numerous factors beyond the official non-fraternization policies. There were profound cultural differences to navigate, language barriers to overcome, and the complex dynamics of occupier and occupied to consider. Many American soldiers struggled with the moral implications of forming romantic attachments to citizens of a nation they had been fighting against, while German women faced suspicion from their own communities about their motivations for associating with foreign soldiers. For Corporal Thomas Anderson, a 21-year-old mechanic from Michigan, these complications became intensely personal when he found himself falling in love with Anna Richter, a 19-year-old German woman whose family had been bombed out of their home in Dresden. Anna was working as a translator for the American military government, using her fluent English to help facilitate communication between occupying forces and local civilians. Thomas had been skeptical of the non-fraternization policies from the beginning, viewing them as impractical and somewhat hypocritical, given the need for ongoing cooperation with German civilians. But when he met Anna, the abstract policy questions became deeply personal concerns about the ethics and practicality of cross-cultural romance in a context of military occupation. Anna was intelligent, funny, and possessed a resilience that Thomas found both admirable and heartbreaking. She had lost her parents and her younger brother in the devastating bombing of Dresden, and was now responsible for caring for her elderly grandmother while trying to build some kind of future from the ruins of her former life. Despite these tremendous challenges, she maintained an optimism and warmth that drew Thomas to her like a magnet. Their relationship developed slowly, through shared work assignments and careful conversations that gradually revealed their mutual attraction. Thomas found himself learning not just German words and phrases, but German ways of thinking and feeling. Anna introduced him to aspects of German culture that had been invisible to him during the war years: poetry, music, philosophy, and art that revealed a depth and sophistication that challenged his preconceptions about German society. But their growing attachment also forced both of them to confront difficult questions about loyalty, identity, and the future. Thomas worried about how his family back home would react if they knew he was romantically involved with a German woman. Anna faced disapproval from some members of her community, who viewed relationships with occupying soldiers as a betrayal of German dignity and honor. The complexity of these relationships was further complicated by the broader context of post-war reconstruction and denazification efforts. American soldiers found themselves in the peculiar position of being both conquerors and liberators, occupiers and aid providers. They were tasked with dismantling the remnants of Nazi ideology while simultaneously working with German civilians to rebuild functional communities and institutions. Major David Sullivan, a 30-year-old lawyer from Philadelphia who had been assigned to work on denazification proceedings, encountered these contradictions firsthand when he met Elizabeth Hartmann, a 28-year-old librarian who had been dismissed from her position during the Nazi era because of her refusal to remove books by Jewish and other undesirable authors from the library's collection. Elizabeth's story challenged David's understanding of German society during the Nazi period. She had not been part of any organized resistance movement, but she had found small ways to preserve and protect works of literature and scholarship that the regime sought to destroy. When possible, she had quietly maintained personal copies of banned books and had continued to lend them to trusted friends and colleagues who shared her commitment to intellectual freedom. Working with Elizabeth to rebuild the town's library system, David found himself confronting the complexity of moral judgment in the aftermath of totalitarian rule. Elizabeth had not actively collaborated with the Nazi regime, but neither had she been able to effectively resist it. She had made compromises to survive while trying to maintain her personal integrity, and David found it difficult to categorize her actions as simply heroic or cowardly. Their professional relationship gradually evolved into something deeper as David came to appreciate not just Elizabeth's knowledge and competence, but her thoughtful approach to the moral questions raised by their work together. She didn't offer simple answers about guilt and innocence, resistance and collaboration. Instead, she helped him understand the painful complexity of choices made under extreme circumstances. As 1945 turned into 1946, the American military began to relax some of the non-fraternization policies in recognition of both their practical unworkability and the need for ongoing cooperation with German civilians in reconstruction efforts. This policy change officially acknowledged what had already become reality in many locations. American soldiers and German civilians were forming personal relationships that extended far beyond the formal requirements of military occupation. The relaxation of official policies, however, did not eliminate the social and cultural challenges facing mixed couples. American soldiers who married German women often faced difficult reactions from family members back home, who struggled to accept their choice to form permanent attachments to former enemies. German women who married American soldiers sometimes found themselves ostracized by their own communities, viewed as traitors who had chosen personal advantage over national loyalty. Captain Robert Hayes, a 27-year-old engineer from Oregon, experienced these challenges firsthand when he decided to marry Greta Zimmerman, a 25-year-old former art student whose family had owned a small gallery before the war. Robert had met Greta while working on reconstruction projects in Munich and had been impressed by her knowledge of art history and her passionate commitment to preserving cultural artifacts that had survived the bombing. Greta had spent much of the war working to protect and hide artworks and cultural objects from both Allied bombing and Nazi looting. Her efforts had been largely successful, but she had paid a personal price in terms of constant stress and the loss of many friends and colleagues who had not survived the war years. Robert found her dedication to preserving beauty and culture in the midst of destruction both inspiring and deeply attractive. When Robert wrote to his parents in Oregon to tell them about his engagement to Greta, the reaction was swift and harsh. His father, a veteran of World War I, expressed disbelief that his son would choose to marry one of them after everything that had happened. His mother worried about the social implications of bringing a German daughter-in-law into their community, where anti-German sentiment remained strong even after the war's end. Similarly, Greta faced criticism from some members of her own family and social circle, who viewed her relationship with an American officer as opportunistic and unpatriotic. Some accused her of seeking personal security and advantage through marriage to a member of the occupying forces, while others questioned her loyalty to German identity and culture. Despite these challenges, Robert and Greta proceeded with their wedding, which took place in a small ceremony in Munich in early 1946. The guest list was carefully chosen to include only those friends and colleagues who supported their union, reflecting the reality that mixed marriages remained controversial in both American and German communities. The personal stories of individual couples illuminate broader patterns in the relationships that developed between American soldiers and German women during the occupation period. These relationships were shaped by factors including loneliness and displacement, cultural curiosity and attraction, practical considerations of survival and reconstruction, and genuine emotional and intellectual connections that transcended national boundaries. For many American soldiers, prolonged contact with German civilians revealed the inadequacy of wartime propaganda in explaining the complex realities of German society. They discovered that German women, like women everywhere, were individuals with their own hopes, fears, talents, and dreams, rather than representatives of a monolithic enemy culture. This recognition of shared humanity often provided the foundation for romantic attraction and emotional attachment. German women, meanwhile, often found in American soldiers qualities that had been devalued or suppressed during the Nazi era: respect for individual dignity and choice, intellectual curiosity, and a less rigid approach to gender roles and social expectations. Many German women had experienced years of increasing restrictions on their educational and professional opportunities under Nazi rule, and contact with American soldiers sometimes offered glimpses of alternative ways of organizing society and relationships. The phenomenon was not universal, of course. Many American soldiers completed their service in Germany without forming significant personal relationships with German civilians, and many German women remained deeply suspicious of or hostile to American personnel. The relationships that did develop often faced significant practical obstacles, including language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and the inherent power imbalances created by military occupation. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, a 23-year-old from Chicago, found himself grappling with these complexities when he was assigned to work with German civilian contractors on rebuilding damaged infrastructure in a small town near Frankfurt. The work required close coordination with local officials and workers, bringing him into daily contact with German civilians who ranged from cooperative to resentful in their attitudes toward the American presence. Among the German workers was Liesl Brenner, a 24-year-old engineer who had been one of the few women allowed to complete technical education during the war, due to severe labor shortages in essential industries. Liesl was competent, direct, and unafraid to challenge American assumptions about the best approaches to reconstruction projects. Michael found her professional confidence both impressive and attractive, particularly since it contrasted sharply with the more deferential behavior he had expected from defeated German civilians. Working together on complex engineering problems, Michael and Liesl developed a mutual respect that gradually evolved into personal affection. Their conversations ranged from technical discussions about construction methods to broader questions about how to rebuild not just physical infrastructure, but social trust and cooperation in the aftermath of war. But their growing relationship was complicated by the reactions of their respective communities. Some of Michael's fellow soldiers questioned his judgment in becoming involved with a German woman, suggesting that such relationships were inherently compromised by the power dynamics of occupation. Some of Liesel's German colleagues and neighbors viewed her association with American personnel as collaboration that betrayed the dignity of their defeated nation. These social pressures forced both Michael and Liesel to think carefully about their motivations and expectations. Was their attraction based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect? Or was it distorted by the unusual circumstances of their meeting? Could a relationship that began in the context of military occupation ever develop into an equal partnership? Or would it always be marked by the original power imbalance between occupier and occupied? The questions were not merely theoretical. As their relationship deepened, Michael and Liesel had to decide whether to pursue marriage, which would require Michael to navigate complex military regulations about overseas marriages, and Liesel to consider immigrating to a country she had never seen to live among people who might view her with suspicion because of her nationality. The challenges facing mixed couples were reflected in broader social attitudes on both sides. American public opinion about Germans remained highly negative throughout the immediate post-war period, with surveys showing that most Americans continued to view Germans as fundamentally militaristic and untrustworthy, even after the Nazi regime's defeat. This sentiment influenced family reactions to soldiers who formed romantic attachments to German women, with many American families expressing concern or disapproval about such relationships. German public opinion was equally complex, shaped by a mixture of defeat, resentment, gratitude for American aid, and concern about national dignity and identity. German women who formed relationships with American soldiers were sometimes accused of seeking material advantages or betraying German honor, while others defended such relationships as natural human connections that transcended political boundaries. These broader social attitudes created additional pressure on individual couples who were already navigating the personal challenges of cross-cultural romance. Many couples found themselves defending their relationships, not just to skeptical family members, but to entire communities that viewed their unions with suspicion or disapproval. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, a 31-year-old career officer from Virginia, experienced these pressures when he fell in love with Margaret Fisher, a 30-year-old widow whose husband had been killed in North Africa in 1943. Morrison had been assigned to work with German civilian authorities on establishing new local government structures, which brought him into regular contact with Margaret, who worked as a secretary and translator for the emerging municipal administration. Margaret was intelligent, well-educated, and demonstrated remarkable political judgment in helping navigate the complex process of establishing democratic institutions in a community that had known only authoritarian rule for over a decade. Morrison found himself relying on her insights and advice as he worked to understand local conditions and attitudes. And he gradually came to appreciate not just her professional competence, but her personal courage in taking on challenging work during a period of tremendous uncertainty. Their professional relationship evolved into friendship and eventually into love. But Morrison faced significant pressure from his military superiors, who worried about the career implications of an officer marrying a German citizen. Some questioned whether such marriages might compromise an officer's effectiveness or create conflicts of interest in future assignments. Others expressed concern about the public relations implications of high-ranking American officers forming permanent attachments to former enemy nationals. For Margaret, the challenges were equally significant. As a widow, she faced economic pressures that made the security offered by marriage to an American officer attractive. But she also worried about accusations that she was entering the relationship primarily for material gain, rather than genuine affection. she was also concerned about the implications of leaving Germany permanently, which would mean abandoning elderly parents and other family members who depended on her support. Despite these challenges, Morrison and Margaret decided to marry, recognizing that their relationship had given them both a sense of hope and purpose that had been missing from their lives since the war began. Their wedding in 1946 was a quiet affair, attended by a small group of friends and colleagues who supported their union, reflecting the reality that mixed marriages remained controversial even as they became more common. As the American occupation of Germany settled into a more routine administrative structure, the relationships between American personnel and German civilians continued to evolve. The initial period of strict non-fraternization gave way to a more complex set of policies that attempted to balance military discipline with the practical necessities of working with German civilians on reconstruction efforts. By 1947, thousands of American soldiers had married German women, creating a significant population of mixed families that challenged simple categories of occupier and occupied, victor and vanquished. These marriages represented more than individual romantic choices. They symbolized a gradual transformation of the relationship between America and Germany, from one based on military conquest to one increasingly focused on cooperation and shared values. The children born to these unions would grow up as living embodiments of this transformation, carrying both American and German cultural heritage, and often serving as bridges between communities that had once viewed each other as implacable enemies. Their existence testified to the power of personal relationships to transcend political boundaries and historical animosities. Staff Sergeant Paul Williams, a 24-year-old from Ohio, found himself contemplating these broader implications when his daughter was born in 1948. Paul had married Helga Richter, a 22-year-old German woman he had met while working on denazification proceedings in a small Bavarian town. Their courtship had been complicated by language barriers, cultural differences, and the disapproval of both of their families. But their mutual attraction and respect had overcome these obstacles. When their daughter Anna was born, Paul found himself thinking about the world she would inherit. Would she grow up to see herself as primarily American or German? Or would she develop some new hybrid identity that combined elements of both cultures? Would the animosities that had shaped her parents' generation continue to influence her life? Or would she be part of a generation that took German-American cooperation for granted? These questions seemed particularly relevant as the broader relationship between America and Germany began to shift in response to emerging Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union. What had begun as a military occupation was gradually transforming into a partnership against a new common enemy, creating opportunities for German-American cooperation that had been unimaginable during the war years. Helga often spoke to Paul about her hopes that their daughter would grow up in a world where nationality mattered less than individual character and achievement. Having experienced the destructive power of nationalism and ethnic hatred during the Nazi era, she was determined to raise Anna with an appreciation for human diversity and a skepticism of ideologies that defined people primarily by their group membership rather than their personal qualities. The evolution of German-American relationships at both personal and political levels reflected broader changes in how Americans understood their role in the world. The war had transformed the United States from a relatively isolationist nation to a global superpower with responsibilities and interests that extended far beyond its own borders. This transformation required new approaches to diplomacy and international relations that emphasized cooperation and mutual understanding rather than simple domination. The marriages between American soldiers and German women represented one small but significant aspect of this larger transformation. These relationships demonstrated that former enemies could become allies and partners when they found common ground based on shared values and mutual respect. They suggested that the deepest and most lasting forms of international cooperation might be built not just on formal treaties and agreements, but on personal relationships and cultural exchange. As the 1940s drew to a close, the question of why American soldiers fell for German women during the war had produced thousands of individual answers in the form of couples who had chosen to build their lives together despite the obstacles they faced. Each relationship was unique, shaped by the particular personalities, circumstances, and choices of the people involved. But collectively, they suggested some broader patterns and themes. American soldiers were attracted to German women, partly because the women they encountered challenged their preconceptions about German society and culture. Instead of finding the fanatical, militaristic population described in wartime propaganda, American soldiers often discovered individuals who were intelligent, cultured, and morally complex. German women who had survived the Nazi era had often developed remarkable resilience, independence, and strength of character that American soldiers found impressive and attractive. German women, meanwhile, were often drawn to American soldiers who represented different approaches to masculinity, relationships, and social organization than what they had known during the Nazi era. American soldiers often demonstrated respect for women's intelligence and capabilities, willingness to engage in intellectual conversations, and less rigid attitudes about gender roles and social hierarchies than had been common in Nazi Germany. The relationships that developed were also shaped by the shared experience of displacement and uncertainty that characterized the post-war period. Both American soldiers and German civilians found themselves far from home, literally or figuratively, trying to make sense of a world that had been fundamentally changed by the war. In each other, they often found companions who understood something about loss, adaptation, and the challenge of building new lives from the ruins of old certainties. But perhaps most importantly, these relationships developed because they represented fundamentally human responses to extraordinary circumstances. Despite the official policies, political tensions, and social disapproval they faced, American soldiers and German women who fell in love were responding to the same basic human needs for connection, understanding, and companionship that have motivated people throughout history. The love stories that emerged from the American occupation of Germany were not simply romantic tales, but complex narratives about forgiveness, reconciliation, and the possibility of building bridges across the deepest historical and cultural divides. They demonstrated that even in the aftermath of the most terrible conflicts, individuals could find ways to see past hatred and suspicion to recognize their shared humanity. As we reflect on these stories from more than 70 years later, they remind us that the most profound transformations in international relations often begin with personal relationships between individuals who choose to see past the categories and stereotypes that divide peoples and nations. The American soldiers and German women who fell in love during the occupation years were pioneers in a process of reconciliation that would eventually transform Germany from America's defeated enemy into one of its closest allies. Their courage in pursuing love across the lines of former enmity helped lay the foundation for the broader German-American partnership that would prove crucial in facing the challenges of the Cold War and building the democratic institutions that continue to shape European and Atlantic cooperation today. In choosing love over hatred, understanding over suspicion, and hope over fear, they demonstrated the power of human relationships to transcend even the deepest political and historical divisions. The story of why American soldiers fell for German women during the war is ultimately a story about the resilience of human connections and the possibility of healing even in the aftermath of the most devastating conflicts. It reminds us that peace is built not just through treaties and formal agreements, but through the countless individual choices that people make to see past old enemies and build new relationships based on mutual respect and understanding. As we drift off to sleep tonight, we can take comfort in these stories of unexpected love and reconciliation that emerge from one of history's darkest chapters. They remind us that even in the most difficult circumstances, people can find ways to connect across cultural and political boundaries, creating hope for healing and cooperation that extends far beyond their own individual lives. In their courage to love across former battle lines, these couples wrote a different kind of history. One measured not in victories and defeats, but in the quiet triumphs of human understanding and the enduring power of love to transform enemies into family. Sweet dreams. And may these stories of reconciliation and unexpected love remind us that even the deepest divisions can be bridged by those brave enough to reach across them with open hearts and minds.